Good evening, and welcome to this online event from the Eckhart Center at Albertus Magnus College. For those of you who haven't joined us before, the Eckhart Center's mission is to engage the community in dialogue by integrating the Dominican values of contemplation and action with the calling to promote a more just and peaceful world. We do this through lectures, panels, workshops, and community initiatives around issues of contemplation, action, justice, and peace. Established by a generous gift from the Dominican Sisters of Peace 4 years ago, we are a ministry of Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut. Albertus is the most diverse Catholic college in New England, with a special focus on the needs of first-generation college students. Albertus was founded by Dominican sisters in 1925, which means that we're nearing our centennial year. To contribute to this celebration, the Eckhart Center will be offering lectures and panels about the distinctive contributions of Dominican sisters and friars to Catholic theology in the 20th century. Tonight's talk is a foretaste of that series. Our guest, Adam Beyt, will examine the contemporary relevance of Dominican spirituality through the prism of mystical political discipleship, an idea articulated by Dominican theologian Edward Schillebeeckx. As it turns out, Albertus has a special connection to Schillebeeckx. In 1983, he visited our campus to receive an honorary degree and to deliver a lecture and homily. Our archivist, Katie White, tracked down an image of this that I'll share now. While presenting this honor, President McNamara, who then went on to be president of Albertus for over 30 years, said the following: Father Schillebeeckx's work, and even more graphically so his own life, have emphasized that we wait for the future by shaping it now, that faith comes as much out of the future as out of the past, and that believers live out in the present the promises of God like a leaven that quickens and renews. And here's the image. Those of you who have been at Albertus for some time will recognize some of these faces. Bishop Peter Rosasa, a treasured presence in New Haven for many years, and our former president, Julia McNamara. This was a great find from the archives as we get ready for our centennial year. When I came across that description from President McNamara, it occurred to me that it could very well describe the Dominican charism more broadly, a call to preach the gospel to the world in order to renew it, in hope and in anticipation of the fulfillment of God's promises. To guide us in exploring the treasures of the Dominican spirituality of contemplation and action, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's guest. Adam Beyt is an adjunct professor at Loyola University Chicago. His research focuses on political theology, theological anthropology, and gender theory. This past fall, he published his first book, Remaking Humanity, Embodiment and Hope in Catholic Theology, which draws on Schillebeeckx to construct a Catholic political theology that responds to dehumanizing violence. Adam was previously visiting assistant professor of theology and religious studies at St. Norbert College. He received his Ph.D. in systematic theology from Fordham University and also holds degrees from the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. On a personal note, Adam was a member of my Ph.D. cohort at Fordham and remains a friend. So I could tell you stories of a Thanksgiving pizza dinner during our first year in the program, or of figuring out the train from Paris to Belgium for a conference, or of countless conversations about theology after class. To summarize all these memories, I can only say that Adam embodies friendly and thoughtful collegiality, a crucial value for doing theology. And so I'm very pleased to welcome him here to the Eckhart Center virtually today. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dunar. And I'd also like to extend gratitude towards the Eckhart Center for inviting me to speak to you folks this evening. If you'll give me just a quick second while I share this. All right. Okay, so I will now begin. As someone who's worked for Jesuit institutions for many years, I'm often struck by their capacity to establish for lack of a better term, a distinct brand regarding how they engage their own tradition. Mission statements within Jesuit institutions are replete with references to finding God in all things, along with valuing specific moral principles like cura personalis, the care for the whole person. As a parallel example, when I taught at St. Norbert College, a school indebted to the Norbertine order, I was struck by the insistent use of the term communio, or community, that was presented as an almost daily affirmation. To find a distinguishing characteristic of the Dominican tradition, one as diverse as Albert Magnus, Meister Eckhart, Thomas Aquinas, Bartolomeo de las Casas, Catherine of Siena, Edward Schillebeeckx, and Timothy Radcliffe, is no simple task. Indeed, this intellectual and spiritual inheritance is a rich tapestry containing many potent and beautiful threads weaved throughout it. Yet I hope to draw attention to one central thread running throughout many thinkers and highlight its contemporary relevance. I understand this thread as a mystical political inheritance. To get at what I mean by this, I will refer to it through the classic lens of the active and contemplative lives. These two lives, often pitted in opposition to one another, are almost always spoken of while referencing the famous biblical passage from Luke 10, verses 38 to 42, the story of Martha and Mary. I'll read this brief pericope now to serve as a refresher to folks. This story is during Jesus' ministry and travels through Galilee with his disciples. As they continued their journey, he entered a village where a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat beside the Lord at his feet, listening to him speak. Martha, burdened with much serving, came to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me for myself to do the serving? Tell her to help me." The Lord said to her in reply, "Martha, Martha, you're anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her." Centuries of interpreters of the text have gravitated towards a stark dichotomy between these two kinds of lives of Martha and Mary, the active life in service of others and the contemplative life spent in prayer, respectively. Many have interpreted the passage as exalting the contemplative life, that of Mary. But as we're going to explore this evening, Dominicans have problematized such an easy hierarchy and dichotomy. So, I want to use this lecture as an opportunity to reflect on Dominican spirituality as the blending of the active and contemplative lives, what I will refer to as a mystical political inheritance. I understand this spirituality as the human, faith-filled, and embodied response to God's mystery incarnated within history. Mystical refers to matters concerning prayer, that which consists of the relationship between ourselves and the absolute mystery undergirding all that is, another way of describing God. I use the word political not to name how we typically think of as electoral politics, but to name participation and involvement within human communities. Indeed, the word politics has its origin in the Greek word poli, a community. Thus, political here captures the relational responsibility we have towards the various communities to which we belong. Viewed through this specific Dominican lens, politics refers to the task of loving and serving one's neighbor. So to finally get to my argument, the mystical political inheritance of Dominican spirituality demands an active engagement with material realities and human suffering, in pursuit of an ever-loving and transcendent God whose love and justice must be incarnated within history. This thread of Dominican spirituality necessitates an embodied compassion that allows us to be transformed and converted by those suffering on the margins. As mentioned in the introduction Professor Dunar provided for me, my work is in deep conversation with the work of Dominican theologian Edward Schillebeeckx. I will use his reflection on mystical political spirituality as a framing device to help guide this conversation tonight. Then I will focus on four thinkers, two of whom are considered classics within Dominican theology, and the other two are 20th and 21st century inheritors of those classical thinkers. Italian Dominican Thomas Aquinas' work seeks to blend the active and contemplative lives while also emphasizing the vital importance of the incarnation. As an inheritor of Thomas's thought, French Dominican theologian Marie-Dominque Chenu applies the themes of the incarnation to the material realities of mid-20th century France. He does this by reflecting on the worker-priest movement, a blending of the active and contemplative lives, and models a transformation of the theology of priesthood to anticipate the signs of the times paradigm so influential at Vatican II. As another classic of Dominican spirituality, Catherine of Siena's mystical reflection on the cross challenges a radical compassion to those who are suffering. As an inheritor of this spirituality of the cross, Shawn Copeland gives an account of discipleship that is at the disposal of the cross, demanding a form of compassionate solidarity, troubled by the spectacle of today's injustices. In surveying these four thinkers using Schillebeeckx's paradigm, I thus want to characterize Dominican spirituality as a dynamic integration of mysticism and politics, the active and contemplative lives, in response to those who are suffering. This spiritual inheritance points to the contemporary relevance of the gospel in present-day circumstances, a prudent negotiation of what Schillebeeckx calls, quote, the past and new possibilities for the future. First, I'm going to sketch Schillebeeckx's theology before reflecting on his reading of the Dominican spiritual tradition to provide a context for his work. Schillebeeckx lived from 1914 to 2009 and was active at the Second Vatican Council. His theology confronts suffering within history through hope. For him, we encounter God within a quest for a more just world. The central symbols for Christian hope takes place through Christ and culminates in God's reign. The Basileo to Theo, or reign of God, also translated as kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God, stands in for the newness of life in God disclosed by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. This symbol describes God's dream for renewed creation, one of radical justice, peace, and love. As many know, the reign of God anticipates God's transformation of creation and was meant to serve as a countersign to the exploitative and domineering political relations of the Roman Empire, imposing its will on first-century Palestine. For Schillebeeckx, the task of Christian discipleship is to incarnate, or to make real, the meaningful positivity of God's reign within history in response to the negativity of suffering and injustice. His account of spirituality thus responds to unjust suffering. According to theologian Christine Alpers, prayer, in Schillebeeckx's thought, is, quote, politically transformative. In an essay entitled Magnificat, a Toast to God, Schillebeeckx provides a guide for how spirituality can respond to harm to the marginalized. Using the Magnificat as an example, the famous hymn of Jesus' mother in Luke, prayer gives glory to a God who incarnates within human history amid suffering. Prayer directs attention towards the greater history of God's saving presence in the world. Spirituality cannot be individualistic, but rather orients us towards others, helping one to recognize potential meaning in history through God. Prayer names, quote, being open to visitation, the coming of God into our history, letting the kingdom of God come, end quote. Such prayer disallows ideology demeaning others through violence, promoting instead a God who acts in history to liberate and bring hope. Applying this concern with justice in response to suffering, Schillebeeckx implements both mysticism and politics in characterizing Dominican spirituality. He recognizes that this spirituality necessitates both the types of lives inspired by Martha and Mary, a transformative response to human suffering. He makes this point more clearly in an essay based on a lecture given to Dutch Dominicans in 1974. In this essay, Schillebeeckx reflects on the story of what he calls the Dominican family. In entering this family, he understands their spirituality as, quote, a critical involvement in the very specific needs and problems of today's church in its historical circumstances, end quote. He also sees the Dominican story as, quote, following Jesus, to be realized in the here and now and in practice. Dominican spirituality balances a relationship with God containing both vertical and horizontal dynamics, presence ado, presence with God, and presence amund, presence to the world, both the mystical and the political, God within prayer and God encountered through loving acts of mercy. Finally, the Dominican spiritual inheritance is a tapestry consisting of a thread and cross thread, initiated by St. Dominic and continued by this family. Schillebeeckx writes, quote, "By thread and cross thread, Dominic wrote a new fabric, created a new religious paradigm. Thus, the Dominican order was born from the charisma of the combination of admonitory and critical recollection of the spiritual heritage of the old monastic and canonical religious figures, with the modernistic religious experiments of the 13th century." End quote. The spirituality of the Dominican thus inhabits the tensions between the thread, tradition, and a cross thread, potential futures for Christian communities. This cross thread upholds a critical view towards the past and present while looking towards the future. To clarify this ambiguous statement, Dominican spirituality embraces emancipatory movements, along with individuals who are often regarded as outliers in society. The spirituality remains open to God's presence while inspired by Christ's compassion, being transformed by those who are suffering. From Schillebeeckx's reflections on mystical political theology and Dominican spirituality, we might glean several defining characteristics: a longing for a more just future, a compassionate response to human suffering, a willingness to be challenged by the signs of the times, and an openness towards new theological horizons and ideas about God, all while being rooted in Christ. So we will now look at 4 Dominican theologians and how our more contemporary voices weave the cross thread by interpreting the tradition in their own contexts. So let's continue with Thomas Aquinas and Chenu's reading of him. The audience might be surprised by my use of Thomas Aquinas, arguably the most famous student of St. Albert Magnus, to speak of Christian spirituality. For many, the 13th century Italian saint set the rigorous standards for Catholic theology, at least from a systematic perspective. His work has influenced a variety of topics, ranging from reflections on human knowledge, the human person, and ethics. As the author of the multi-volume Summa Theologica, a text famous for its breadth and sophistication, one would think he has little to say about spirituality, especially given his perceived unrelenting systematicity. But from the many complex ideas running throughout Thomas's thought, we can reflect on 2 salient themes. First, the blending of the active and contemplative lives. Second, a way of reflecting on reality based on the incarnation. On point number 1, Thomas engages the thought of Gregory the Great and affirms that the contemplative life is meant to bring one closer to the highest truth, that is, God. For him, the best way to accomplish this endeavor is to reflect on sacred truths in the context of the study of sacred doctrine, teachings one can lovingly inherit and pass on to others. In a sense, Thomas interprets the Martha-Mary dichotomy through the lens of his own vocation, participating in a religious order that combines teaching, preaching, and the study of sacred doctrine. While we might chuckle at Thomas's own biases to say that his life happens to be the superior life, I also think this reading must be read in the broader context of his work. Thomas recognizes that the highest theological virtue is charity, a love of one's neighbor to encounter God. The contemplative life must be enriched by love of neighbor, the task of becoming friends with God, as one might think, what we might call a politics of charity. What do I mean by a politics of charity? Thomas, while engaging the Greek philosopher Aristotle, understands humans as social animals who are embedded in their communities, what we might recall as our root for the word politics. For Thomas, following God necessitates the virtue of charity, love of neighbor within one's community. As a more contemporary example of this type of charity oriented towards one community, we might think of the beloved community motif running throughout Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches and writings, a vision for a community built on justice and love. So the quote I have here, "The end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. This type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love, not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing, which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of men. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. So MLK is getting at what I mean by here through this idea of a beloved community, a form of political charity. Love thus helps to know and encounter God. The active and contemplative lives, those of Martha and Mary, enrich one another through charity. The mixture of both remains crucial. He writes, and I quote at length, "Accordingly, we must say that the work of the active life is twofold. One proceeds from the fullness of the contemplation, such as teaching and preaching. And this work is more excellent than simple contemplation. For even as it is better to enlighten than merely to shine, so it is better to give to others the fruit of one's contemplation than merely to contemplate. The other work of the active life consists entirely in outward occupation, for instance, almsgiving, receiving guests, and the like, which are less excellent than the works of contemplation. Thus, the active and contemplative lives form and enrich one another, all in the pursuit of the highest good, that is, the love of God." Along with this meditation on the blending in the active and contemplative lives, Thomas also bases his thought around the incarnation. Now, the incarnation is not just a name for the Christian doctrine of God's becoming human, but points to a way of understanding how to be human and how God communicates in ways that humans can understand. This has consequences for the active and contemplative lives. According to Thomas scholar Mark Jordan, the Summa is structured around how human beings know, through their bodies. Thomas is a materialist insofar as he recognizes the limited ways in which humans have the capacity to know through our embodied senses and the forms of meaning created therein. There is a fancy Latin phrase that is often associated with this theme in Thomas's thought: "Quicquid recipitor ad modum recipitans recipitor." The phrase is directly translated as "that which is received in the mode of the receiver." This idea runs throughout Thomas's understanding of human knowledge. This is also the reason for the incarnation. Humans know the world through their embodied senses, and God subsequently becomes incarnated in material realities to know humanity and the rest of creation more closely and invite us further into God's salvific love. Thomas's work is thus built around a loving response to the incarnation, to greater plunge into God's mystery through the active and contemplative lives. Now, this idea of framing the incarnation as the concern for materialities seems very abstract. To better understand what this incarnated spiritual looks like, we turn to our more contemporary interlocutor, the cross-thread for Thomas's Dominican strand, Marie-Dominque Chenu. Marie-Dominque Chenu lived from 1895 to 1990 and was a French Dominican, often associated with the Nouvelle Theologie movement. This movement, whose name means new theology, was condemned from breaking from the perceived theological norms of Thomism. In the intervening centuries since Thomas wrote his theology, the inheritors of his thought had positioned the tradition in the defensive, especially given the philosophical and cultural changes that had taken place in Western Europe since the Enlightenment. As Thomas had in many ways become the official theological mascot of Roman Catholicism, his interpreters had turned his thought into a closed system. His thought had become disincarnated. By this I mean a way of understanding the world that had been removed from history, an assertion of abstract principles to be accepted as the litmus test for being Catholic. In 1932, Chenu was put in charge of Le Salchoir, the French Dominican house of studies that had been moved to Belgium. It was here that he worked to rethink Thomas's thought for a new century. Chenu's theology demonstrates the cross-thread of Dominican spirituality by inheriting the two themes of the mixture of the active and contemplative lives, along with incarnational thinking in his own context. I will treat the latter before attending to the former. For Chenu, the incarnation establishes a framework for a critical reappraisal of Thomas, and orients one towards the concrete and material realities of history. He depicts the incarnation as, quote, a deep insertion into the very heart of life and its most pressing demands, of a new sap that will find the vessels of its nurturing circulation in the very tissue of our worries, our labors, our institutions, end quote. This orientation towards the incarnation necessitates a historical consciousness. Chenu's reading of Thomas recognizes the need for the critical reappraisal and creative reimagining during the intervening centuries between the angelic doctor's time and contemporary life. This reading challenges any theologian wanting to honor Thomas's legacy to not just recapitulate abstract theological ideas, but instead consider new ways of portraying God's saving presence within history. Reading Chenu's thought, theologian Krzysztof Podoborowski claims that the Church must continue the task of incarnation through active engagement in the world. Quote, to follow the law of incarnation means to participate in living tradition and to be a member of the Church as continued incarnation. In conjunction with what has been said about the direction and content of history, incarnation will mean that the progressive humanization of history is the way of divinization. The mystical political inheritance of Dominican spirituality, represented by Thomas's legacy, necessitates not just an active engagement with the world, but a contemplative willingness to be transformed by the encounters with the mystery from lived experience. This worldview, inspired by Thomas, is what theologian Mary Kate Holman calls incarnational engagement. As an example of this incarnational engagement in action, Chenu interprets the worker-priest movement as God's presence within history, the task of solidaristic witness and political charity, a blending of the active and contemplative lives. The worker-priest movement, which began in the 1940s and lasted roughly a decade and a half, was an attempt for the French clergy to be in radical solidarity with working class folks. Inspired by both Marxist and Christian thought, this movement sought to embed the clergy within the concrete realities of the oppressed. The worker priest would toil alongside the poorest of factory laborers, doing hard labor while also fulfilling their tasks as priests, such as saying daily mass and administering the sacraments. They often lived in dire poverty and worked with communist organizations for unionizing efforts. Dominican priests were involved with such efforts, including one named Jacques Lowe. He integrated prayer into his labor as a worker priest. Historian of the movement, Oscar Arnell, writes, Jacques Lowe was especially creative while on the docks. At first, his supplications to God were for mere survival under the labor that fatigued him. But with the passage of time, he developed a rule of contemplation surrounding the pile of sacks he had to load or unload. He would link his work burdens to the rosary prayers, the Station of the Cross, or the mysteries of Christ. In such ways, many of the worker priests tied their spiritual life to the concrete reality of their oppression. The task of incarnational engagement for this community sought to produce the mystical political dialectic as a dynamism between praxis, reflection, praxis. In his later writing, Chenu would identify this as the orthopraxy that flows from the people of God. Chenu himself did not work as a worker priest, but supported this movement from a theological perspective. In his reflection on the worker priest movements, Chenu encouraged priests to have a radical presence in their communities in advocating for structural change. He saw the task of intellectual engagement as a parallel to that of Thomas Aquinas. In the same way, Thomas was willing to engage non-Christian thinkers like Averroes and Aristotle to understand the gospel in his milieu. Chenu believed that the task of theology was to engage contemporary interlocutors, which for him consisted of the Marxist thought running throughout Europe. Inspired by this incarnational thinking and a blending of the active and contemplative lives, Chenu's work sought to attend to the signs of the times, a catch-all phrase that characterized the Church's renewed relationship towards the world after the Second Vatican Council. We might think of this as a shift towards engaging the world through dialogue, thus becoming a church that is incarnated deeply within history rather than distant and abstract. I should also note that Chenu's theology impacted another recent voice of our time. The late, great Dominican theologian and priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, studied with Chenu during his time in Europe, and sees the thinker as having deeply influenced his theology. As one of the founders of liberation theology, Gutierrez's work helped to shape the theological milieu that influenced not a Dominican, but a Jesuit, Pope Francis. The last pair of theologians I want to talk about tonight help emphasize a compassionate response to human suffering. Catherine of Siena, an Italian saint from the 14th century, reflects on this topic through a mystical political response to Christ on the cross. Our more contemporary interlocutor, Shawn Copeland, helps to develop Catherine's reflections on compassion that responds to the hideous spectacle of those who are crucified by today's injustices. Catherine of Siena, as many know, was a lay Dominican sister who was one of the 4 women doctors of the church. She, along with Teresa of Avila, was among the first women theologians to achieve this status in 1970. Living for 33 short years in the middle of the 14th century, Catherine is famous not only for her writings on spirituality, specifically her dialogue, but also for her papal correspondences. As a woman in the church, she offered a prophetic demand for reconciliation during the tumult of the Avignon papacy, a time in which there were multiple individuals claiming to be pope. She is also famous for speaking to the Roman Curia, making her a notable voice of authority for women within church history. Among her many writings, her dialogue stands out as a reflection between the soul and God by centering a compassionate response to suffering, especially those who are suffering like Christ. As she meditates on different physical parts of Christ on the cross, she compares it to climbing a ladder, a means of getting closer to God. She writes, "The first stair is the feet, which symbolizes the affections. For just as the feet carry the body, the affections carry the soul. My son's nailed feet are a stair by which you can climb by his side, where you will see revealed his inmost heart. For when the soul has climbed up on the feet of affection and looked with her mind's eye into my son's open heart, she begins to feel love of her own heart in his consummate and unspeakable love." She adds, "Then the soul, seeing how tremendously she is loved, is herself filled to overflowing with love." The lengthy, mystical, political, spiritual reflection on the soul's journey to know and love God always connects to the crucified Christ, to compassion and love of neighbor, a theological leitmotif running throughout this text and other parts of her writing. Of course, like any other thinker, we need to contextualize her work within her time. Careful readers might assume that she is rendering forms of suffering holy by focusing so intensely on Christ's pain on the cross. Many theologians, such as Dolores Williams and Elizabeth Johnson, have critiqued this understanding of the cross that sees human suffering made holy. A closer reading of Catherine's theology avoids this harmful interpretation of the crucifixion. For her, this radical compassion that comes from reflecting on the mystery of the cross is meant to draw us towards love of neighbor, a love that overflows into our lives. Charity for her, quote, "gives life to all virtue," end quote. Indeed, compassion to those who suffer helps to fuel the furnace of this charity. The contemplative practice to reflect on Christ's suffering helps to connect to the active practice of love of neighbor. Such compassionate love of neighbor is exemplified by Catherine's own willingness to advocate for peace during a chaotic period of the institutional church. She inhabits what theologian Diana Villegas refers to as incarnate spirituality. Note again how the word incarnation has such potent meaning for many Dominicans. Rather than become a contemplative hermit, she was compelled to engage those around her. Her spirituality means, quote, "God works in history through particular individuals and calls persons with unique qualities to certain ministries," end quote. She thought to find compassion for a church that was strife with division. Dominican theologian Mary Catherine Hilkert writes, quote, "Catherine's political and ecclesiastical interventions likewise centered on the teachings of Christ that were to be learned at the table of the cross." Hilkert, citing a historical example, adds, "When the authorities in Bologna were placing heavy burdens on the poor and appointing other officials on the basis of partisanship, prejudice, and bribery, Catherine called for their conversion as a participation in the kenosis of the self-emptying of Jesus." End quote. Likewise, it is in compassion towards those who are suffering that might encounter the overflowing love of God. She recognizes that the suffering and division plaguing the church at that time were not the last word, especially given Christ's radical solidarity. Indeed, it was Catherine's turning towards reflecting on Jesus' suffering that compelled her to love her neighbors amid a wounded church, a mystical and political response to those in need, a clear blending of the active and contemplative lives. I now turn to Copeland's work to help bring Catherine's reflection on the suffering of the cross and compassion to a more contemporary milieu. Specifically, how this mystical political inheritance necessitates living at the disposal of the cross. Shawn Copeland has become one of the pivotal American theological voices today. Like the other three figures mentioned, she became a member of the Dominican spiritual family. Initially, her time in religious life began with the Felician Sisters. After she received pushback for working to prevent the closing of predominantly Black Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Detroit, she transferred to the Adrian Dominican Sisters in the 1970s to pursue uninhibited social justice work. In the mid-1990s, her vocation drew her away from religious life, and she has since become a layperson. She taught at Boston College for several years before retiring in 2019. Her work is still impacted by Dominican spirituality and undoubtedly showcases its mystical political inheritance. Copeland's work responds to the suffering of the oppressed through solidaristic compassion. Her theology scrutinizes how myriad historical processes, specifically those concerning race and gender, have harmed the imago Dei, the belief that humans are made in the image and likeness of God and are sacred. In contemporary classics like In Flesh and Freedom, Copeland catalogs the litany of traumas done to Black women's bodies during the institution of chattel slavery and its many afterlives. In doing so, she charts a solidaristic path, aspiring to embody the freedom of Christ by defending the imago Dei. Theologian Beyt depicts Copeland's theology as confronting alterity, those persons that have been cast down low as society's pariahs. Copeland's turn to those made others orients us towards an emancipatory praxis of loving one's neighbor. She writes, "The neighbor is whoever is denounced, dismissed, and discarded because of age or infirmity, or being differently abled, or religious or political affiliation, or culture or race or ethnicity, or gender or sex or sexual orientation, or economic or social class, or cultural impoverishment. In short, the neighbor is whoever is weak, repressed, forgotten, victimized, and excluded. Whoever has been made to feel that his or her life is trivial, dispensable, and does not matter in the modern colonial global design." This concern with human suffering and harm done to the imago Dei leads Copeland to reflect on the cross and those who were crucified, experience a kind of socially formed suffering. In her essay, To Live at the Disposal of the Cross, Copeland sketches a mystical political account of theology that develops Catherine of Siena's reflection on compassion. This essay begins with a sense of sadness and shock when seeing a Black woman look for food in a garbage dumpster. The sight, or a spectacle, leads to reflection on what it means to live at the disposal of the cross, quote, exposed, vulnerable, open to the wisdom and power and love of God, end quote. She writes, "The cross of Jesus calls us to conversion, to radical transformation of life for life. For his cross teaches us that conversion of life is not merely something about which we speak, rather, despite whatever the consequences, the living out and living out of that transformation is the subject of our daily struggle," end quote. This relationship with Jesus is one that is mystical and demands a solidaristic praxis, as an embodied task of dismantling the social sins that dehumanize others and defile the imago Dei. She reads the Gospel according to Luke as offering an account of Jesus' ministry devoted to compassionate solidarity, one characterized by the inbreaking of God's reign. In a manner similar to Schillebeeckx's theology, she interprets this reign as a transformation of social relations, one of radical justice and love, wherein those made holy are uplifted, and that which dehumanizes is transformed to be just. She reflects on the scandal of Christ's death on the cross. In first-century Palestine, a land being occupied by a dominating empire, she notes that being sentenced to death on the cross was a form of public execution in its time. Such a death was not an object of devotion, but a display of imperial might, a manner of showing the Roman Empire's control over other people's bodies. For her, the resurrection over such a public spectacle of death meant to communicate that imperial might was not the last word. God's reign breaks into the reign of sin, that which dehumanizes. The hope of God's reign resists all the spectacle of death that crucify the marginalized in the past and present. Compassionate solidarity means addressing those who are crucified by today's injustices. Copeland turns to Catherine's reflection on the cross in the dialogue and draws a spiritual connection to Jacob's Ladder, an African-American spiritual, invoking compassion and nearness to God. She turns to the suffering of those harmed by the legacy of slavery to give access to their spiritual worldview, envisioning a theology that affirms the fullness of Black bodies. She looks specifically to the work of Josiah Henson, a former enslaved man turned into a preacher and abolitionist. Henson, as a theologian, was able to envision a kind of radical compassion that affirmed the full humanity of those forced into chattel slavery. Comparing the spiritual reflection of Catherine of Siena and Josiah Henson, Copeland writes, "Loving as Jesus loved, Catherine challenged a warring society and a fragmented church with a message of peace and reconciliation. Loving as Jesus loved, Henson confronted a slaveholding society and church with a demand for justice and transformation." Thinking with both theologians, Copeland reflects on the spectacle of injustice, those vivid images that burn into our minds and challenge us to compassionate solidarity, like the spectacle of the Black woman looking for food in a dumpster. This solidarity, brought about by a compassionate response to the crucified spectacle of those suffering, quote, sends us into streets and alleys, shelters and schools, homes and hospices, to find and feed those who are despised, abused, and marginalized. This mystical political spirituality incarnates God's radical reign, responding to the suffering of others. Each of these Dominican thinkers demonstrates this thread running throughout Dominican spirituality. A mystical political inheritance challenges us to turn to the most marginalized. Thomas helps emphasize how these two lives must be intertwined. Chenu showcases how we must take the incarnation seriously by a genuine engagement with the world, recognizing that this inheritance is to be embodied through action. Catherine of Siena reminds us of the necessity for compassion, and Copeland turns us to the spectacles of suffering we're often tempted to turn away from. To return to the famous Martha and Mary typology that began this lecture, this tradition necessitates a spiritual way of being in the world that responds to that which dehumanizes, demanding that we not reject, but embrace both lives. So to go back to the cross-thread metaphor Schillebeeckx presents, it remains to the contemporary inheritors of this mystical political spirituality to weave the new possibilities for tomorrow. I believe reflecting on this inheritance raises several key questions. Here are a few that come to mind, at least to me. How do we respond to the suffering of those in Palestine, Sudan, Ukraine, or any number of places experiencing seemingly endless conflict? How do we respond to the legacy of white supremacism and sexism here? How do we respond to the rise of transphobia, harming the dignity of our many transgender and non-binary siblings? As exemplified by recent events in California, how do we respond to the suffering caused by the climate crisis? It is my hope that we hold on to this thread as we weave the next section of this rich tapestry for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beyt, for that rich exploration of the thread and cross-thread of Dominican theology. I'd like to invite those present to send us questions, if you would like. On your screen for Zoom webinar, you should see a button that says Q&A, and you can feel free to use that to send questions and comments to us, and I can relay that to Dr. Beyt, and we can talk about them. I'd like to start out with a question. First of all, I'd like to express appreciation for this extended metaphor of thread and cross-thread, because I think it gets at the integrative nature of Dominican thought that really bears witness to the fact that the incarnation, as well as being a theological reality that we affirm, then also becomes a measure by which the adequacy of our theology can be measured. And that's a beautiful thing, right? Our thinking about God and our thinking about the church can't be separated from the central claim of faith that Jesus became human. My question is about the metaphor as Schillebeeckx surfaced it in historical context. Now, if I were to go to a theological conference and I heard a theologian speaking about thread and cross thread, it would probably be a feminist theologian. The symbol of we oftentimes in decolonial contexts, post-colonial contexts, the theme of weaving often comes up as a methodological claim, and then also a assertion of the importance of theological attention to the daily lives of people in post-colonial settings, especially women. So I wonder to what extent Schillebeeckx was aware of the potential of that image as feminist when he made it. And I ask this in particular because the Dominican order has always been a lot more female than male. From the very beginning, when Dominic founded the order, he founded the Order of Sisters first. And to this day, a supermajority of members of the Dominican order are sisters. Did that factor into Schillebeeckx's thought and use of that metaphor?
That's interesting. So Schillebeeckx is someone who I think is very much open towards engaging different kinds of critique, especially a little bit. So a lot of the material that I was pulling from was coming from his later material after the Second Vatican Council. To kind of go back to this like metaphor of threads, he became a lot more after the Second Vatican Council attuned to what Mary Catherine Hilkert calls the scarlet thread running throughout history, how to respond to different forms of suffering or what I also label as dehumanizing violence as well, something that threatens this new humanity announced by the reign of God as well, what he develops using the term humanum. So I don't think he so what's interesting is I don't think he necessarily had this specific like feminist idea running through it. Yet he also seemed very, very open to receiving criticisms from other people. Especially when it came from liberation theologians as well. Some of the critiques that he actually made for some of the folks who were engaging the conversations within the Frankfurt School were actually that they didn't actually carry out the ideas and to their logical conclusion, that he wanted these ideas to be incarnated as well. So he's certainly someone who would be open to those kind of criticism. But I do think one thing that is kind of frustrating with Schillebeeckx's thought is he doesn't engage feminist thinkers as much as I would like him to, even though he's very open to that kind of reception as well.
Thank you. We have two questions now. One is from we have three questions. Hopefully we'll get to all three and more. The first question is from Alberta's faculty member, Dr. John Sozek, who is the department chair of our Department of Philosophy and Religion. Hello, John. He says, many thanks, Dr. Beyt, for this engaging presentation and your remarks on these thought-provoking authors. I've been reflecting lately on the relationship between individual spiritual life and practice and the institutional Catholic Church. When Schillebeeckx calls for involvement in the problems of today's church, as you mentioned he did in 1974, I'm supposing he had in mind a view of church as the people of God in the manner of Vatican II, rather than the institutional church. What is the proper role, though, in your view, of the teachings and canonical positions of the institutional church as individual Catholics seek to actively engage with material realities and practice embodied compassion? I'd be keen to hear both your thoughts on this, as well as how you think Schillebeeckx might have responded.
Right. So Schillebeeckx's most detailed account of his reflection on ecclesiology would be his text just called Church, kind of an obvious starting point for that. So more details can be found there. So he would understand specifically the institutional church as something that is meant to help guide and participate in the task of helping incarnate the reign of God. So this is something that we've seen that Dr. Dunar mentioned in his introduction as well, from that remarks as well, and also stuff in theologians such as Ignacio Ellacuría, a Jesuit voice as well, that they're meant to serve as the leaven for the reign of God. That's how he would understand the community too. So especially with his reflections on the Second Vatican Council, he was in many ways very much open to affirming the ability of the lay people. In one instance, in some of the collections of his essays, he actually wrote to different dissenting communities, and ones that were almost like on the outside of the church, and ones that would be one that would be a lot more oriented towards what is going on the ground, so to speak. So he would understand the institutional church as helping to participate in that task, but one that in many ways very much comes from the work of the lay people. He's not the model of like the docile lay people that one might get in a preconciliar perspective.
So am I hearing you right in that we might call Schillebeeckx a kind of proto-synodal thinker in that way?
I think so as well. A lot of his thought, which would get into more details than I would have to cover right now, is very dialectical and relying on differences and tensions. And so his understanding of authority would affirm the role of the institutional church, theologians, and also lay people as well, and kind of understand them as in dialectical tension with one another while working to anticipate and incarnate the reign of God. And that way, we could see some of his work as helping to affirm some of the themes of synodality we've talked about a lot more lately among the church.
Our next question is actually from somebody who you cited in the course of your presentation, which is fun. This is from Mary-Kate Holman, who is at Fairfield University. She writes, I really enjoyed how Dr. Beyt treated figures across time, identifying the shared spirituality that informs each of their theologies. Super interesting approach. If you were to approach this chronologically, could you identify how Schillebeeckx himself was influenced by the earlier figures? And she mentions Aquinas, Catherine, Chenu.
Right. Unfortunately, Schillebeeckx engages with a lot of these figures, but doesn't really engage with so much with Catherine of Siena, at least not nearly to the same degree that he engages with Thomas's thought. Chenu was one of his teachers, and so he reflects a great deal about the incarnation. So in the Latin phrase that I mentioned, which translates to that which is received, is known as in the mode of the receiver, roughly speaking. I can never remember the Latin phrase exactly on spot. Sorry, I'm not that good a theologian, I guess, or my Latin isn't that good. That was something that he took very seriously in terms of how he engaged contemporary thought. So he actually got in trouble with what would now be referred to as the dicastery for the doctrine of faith. What would used to be the CDF. It's like our version of and with your spirit. I can't remember when there's a name change for something. And so whenever he got in trouble for his theology, he just said, whenever someone asked him what hermeneutics was or what some of the philosophical engagement was, he just referenced this idea from Thomas. So he was very much engaging with a lot of the work of Chenu and Thomas, though less so for Catherine of Siena. And to kind of also draw a parallel for this, Copeland also references and engages with Schillebeeckx's works, and obviously with Catherine of Siena's too. And her encounter with Thomas is mostly through Bernard Lonergan, a more 20th century interpretation of Thomas Aquinas.
Thank you. Our next question is from another Fordham voice. Alex Gruber asks, thank you for your lecture, Dr. Beyt. Given declining numbers of vowed religious in orders like Dominicans, how do you see lay people vowed in tertiary orders, like Catherine of Siena, or formed in an order's charism, like Shawn Copeland, taking on more conspicuous or powerful roles in continuing to weave the threads of the Dominican charism and other orders' charisms? And I appreciate that question, Alex, because part of that question, Adam, is you and me as lay people, but also theologians who work with Dominicans. What are your thoughts on lay people taking on roles and helping to weave that cross thread and picking up that charism?
So I cannot necessarily speak to one specific aspect of of a specific order, like lay orders within Dominicans or other orders, for example. But I mean, to kind of go back to what my earlier comment was, I understand lay folks also as co-creators of the church. Ones that have their own theological voices and ways of making sense of this specific cross thread. One thing that I think is very affirmative and helpful and enriching for the life of the church is understanding that lay people, in incarnating and making sense of this tradition within their own lived realities, are also, in a sense, theologians. Not in the ways that both you and I are theologians who are professionally trained within a guild, but rather who make sense of the tradition in that context. So I understand that the lay people help to build the church, help to weave this crossthread by interpreting it, incarnating it with their own lives, and create their own theology. Another example of this would be the famed base ecclesial communities that were studied, especially in Latin America. These groups of folks that would read biblical texts together, often in absence of a member of the institutional church, such as an ordained priest, and would make sense of these texts and emerge with their own theological voices that come with that would articulate God with those who are oppressed.
Thank you. And I invite more questions. We have enough time perhaps for, I think, 2 more questions if folks would like to post them in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, I might ask, so you just published a book in the fall, and it's described as drawing on Schillebeeckx's Catholic response to dehumanizing violence. Can you talk a little bit about what strands of Schillebeeckx's thought, especially the ones you may have mentioned in the lecture, connect to what you do in that book? And can you give us maybe a 2-minute summary of what you do in your first published work?
Oh, sure. So the figure whom I didn't really engage in this particular lecture has to do with the American philosopher and feminist thinker, Judith Butler, who reflects on how human bodies are entangled with different kinds of categories, how bodies are embedded within a specific context and how categories are imposed upon them, and how those categories sometimes might exclude others through categories of race, through categories of gender, that might reinscribe structures of physical or institutional violence. So how theological anthropology, how we talk about the human person in ways that cause different kinds of violence. And so I connect that with some of Schillebeeckx's work, specifically his reflection on hope. And so I understand, and bringing these thinkers together, I understand the task of Christian discipleship of incarnating God's reign, building a more just world where different types of humanity have the capacity to flourish. So for some of Butler's more recent work, they reflect on violence in ways that are more expansive than how we might think of violence as an act or form of physical harm, but rather anything that might consign someone to a premature death. And so Butler posits a form of nonviolence as a way of generating new types of worlds where different types of humanity can flourish. And so I bring that into connection to this idea called this theme within Christian theology known as eschatology, a reflection on the last things, and this radical task of building a new world where different types of humanity can flourish. And so it's a way of reflecting on Christian discipleship built around nonviolence, allowing, again, different kinds of the humanity to come to a more graced fulfillment.
I'm going to take the last question too, and it's going to refer back to an observation you made at the very beginning of your lecture, because it mirrors conversations that we have in the Dominican world all the time. You observed that being formed in Jesuit institutions, there's a vocabulary that is consistent from institution to institution. You're going to hear about cura personalis. You're going to hear about the examen. If you're out on the street and you happen to see someone with a hoodie on from another Jesuit institution, you're going to have common vocabulary. It's a little more difficult to do that with Dominican institutions. And I think the variety of thought you cover in your lecture and this image of thread and cross-thread, it kind of shows why. When you have an orientation that is specifically contextual and incarnational. When you have a articulation of the tradition that focus kind of on personalities and figures, and traditions that flow from those personalities and figures, like Albert, more so than practices. The Jesuits, I guess, have their figures as well, but oftentimes it's tied to concrete spiritual practices. In a way, Dominican life and spirituality resists standardization. So my question for you is, in a higher educational setting or in a setting where Dominicans want to express what it means to be Dominican succinctly and in a way that might make sense across contexts, how might you, in a few phrases, summarize and characterize what the Dominican tradition means to an undergraduate, or to somebody who's attending a Dominican nature center, or to somebody who's being taken care of Dominicans in a senior center? Do you think there can be a set of standard terms? We have the 4 pillars, but not all institutions use them. Or do you think that a part of the beauty of the Dominican tradition is that it is contextual? And maybe that flexibility and incarnational focus is the strength.
See, I understand that the incarnational focus is something that can be an ongoing motif that runs across Dominican thought. So, I mean, I use the word incarnation on virtually all of those different figures in some capacity. So I think a starting point for reflecting on this blending of this mystical political inheritance that I'm talking about is thinking about one's own incarnated context. This task of political charity that MLK presents means one is embedded within a unique community. So students could perhaps think about the different relationships and communities in which they are incarnated. What it's like to think about their specific campus community, their classroom, their local neighborhood, or perhaps a global community. To kind of go back to MLK, not a Dominican, but someone who could quote a Dominican while he's in prison, letter from Birmingham City Jail. He quotes Thomas Aquinas just, off the top of his head. We could think about how we are connected and neighbors with people across the globe as well. So I think, though, that this idea of the incarnation, it is actually a good starting point, and recognizing that the active and contemplative lives is meant to encompass one's whole existence, and thinking about that community and love of neighbor.
That's really nicely put. And for the benefit of Alberta's folks in the room, I'll make the observation that Dr. Beyt just kind of referred to all 4 pillars in describing what the integrative, incarnational orientation of Dominican spirituality does. And I think that's, even though the 4 pillars are not standardized across campus, I think in every setting they express this way in which we are integrated in communities. We're inviting students to reflect on themselves as members of those communities. So I appreciate your elaboration on that. Would you like a final word before I make a pitch for our future spring programs and say some thank yous for today?
Oh, I just wanted to thank you, folks, for giving me the opportunity to speak for this evening, and to be the first one to help initiate this exciting new program. So thank you so much for having me this evening.
And thank you again, Adam. Again, in our centennial year, we're going to be exploring more 21st century Dominican thinkers as a way of thinking about the Dominican tradition as it relates to the Alberta story. I'll also say that this was our very first online-only event for the Eckhart Center. Almost everything we do is live stream, but this is the very first online event. So for those of you who have been to other events in person or online, or for those of you who are here for the first time, I'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to send me an email, or if you see me in person, chat with me about how you think this went. To close, I'd like to tell you about some other things that are happening at the Eckhart Center. So this spring, we have a variety of dynamic programs, a few of which I'm able to fit on this screen. Later this month, for our Aquinas lecture, we have a visit from Dr. Christine Führer-Henze, another voice from Fordham, to speak on enacting solidarity in our time and place. On March 3rd, we're going to be continuing the conversation we had at the Justice panel in the fall about seeking correctional reform, and that is in conversation with corrections officers, former inmates, and members of our criminal justice program. And then on March 20th, we have a visit from Gracie Morbitzer, who is the artist behind the Modern Saints. She's doing a program called We Can All Be Saints, Saints, Gifts, and Art with Modern Saints. She paints the heroes of the tradition in a contemporary style, true to their original ethnicity. Her artwork is beautiful. She's going to give a wonderful presentation. We hope you'll be able to join us. And all of these, you can join us either in person or online. To RSVP for any of these events, to get more information, or to subscribe to our newsletter, please go to albertus.edu/Eckhart. Any program at a small college requires a lot of hands to make it a success. And so I'd like to end with some thank yous. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Dominican Mission and Ministries team, Sister Ann Kilbride, Sister Kathy Buchanan, Sister Susan Olson, and Ariana Miller. I'd also like to thank Eddie Sam, who was our IT contact for tonight. Everything went off without a hitch, and that's because Eddie really put a lot of thought into how to put this together technically. So I'd like to give special thanks to him. Thanks to Carolyn Behan from the events team and to Katie White, our archivist, who immediately upon seeing the announcement for this event called our attention to the fact that skilled vets once walked on this campus and received an honorary degree. And of course, thank you to our guest, Adam, for such a rich presentation. I'm sure this will be a seed that grows into many conversations as we go forward, and to everybody who joined us tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining us. We will look forward to seeing you next time.